Hey, what's going on, everybody? Brent Hyden here, coming at you on this Wednesday morning, talking tonight's 10-game slate around the association. Before we dig into the slate, quick reminder, please make sure you hit that subscribe button down below. That way you get notified every single time I post a brand new video. Also, if you happen to stumble across this video and you're not already following me on Twitter, please make sure you hit that follow button on the Twitter machine. My handle at BrentHyden1 is in the description down below, where you can click the link in the banner at the top of the page. Also, my Patreon account is in the banner as well. For those of you that are not signed up to my projections and content package, there is some new monthly offers available to you if you head over to my Patreon page. There is also the ability to sign up directly through me on Twitter for the full season plus playoffs for a very affordable price. But without further ado, let's take a look at the slate. Starting with the first game of the night, we're going to talk about Cleveland and Golden State. Golden State 11-point favorites in this one, 223.5 over under. Sam Decker, David Nwaba, Ante Zizic, Kevin Love, and Draymond Green all going to be out for this game. Tristan Thompson coming in has recorded a double-double in 7 of the last 8 games. He has been absolutely crushing. Looking at the Golden State side of this game, obviously, Stephen Curry and Kevin Durant, very, very, very solid plays. With Draymond Green already being ruled out, Damian Jones being ruled out, taking a look at the usage for these guys, and it's all really, really, really good. Looking at hang on one second. Looking at Stephen Curry. Curry, 44.5% usage rate and 1.57 fantasy points per minute with those guys off the floor. We have Kevin Durant, 38.3% usage rate, 1.56 fantasy points per minute with those guys off the floor. Klay Thompson, interestingly enough, 34% usage rate, 1.08 fantasy points per minute. Klay Thompson is very interesting in this spot to me here, coming in at 7,100 on DraftKings, 7,200 on FanDuel. Has been, of course, taking a lot of shots, has at least 20 field goal attempts in 3 of the last 4 games, has been shooting pretty well over the last few games, 48% from the floor, 41% from 3. I do like Klay Thompson a decent amount in tournaments here. Looking at the rest of this, obviously, Stephen Curry and Kevin Durant are fantastic plays here. Both of these guys project to be pretty solid options. Stephen Curry clocking in at 9,700 on DraftKings, 9,700 on FanDuel. The preferred option, I think, for me out of the group just because of the decreased price compared to Kevin Durant, but it's not a monster difference as far as who I like between the two. It just comes down to price. I think both are perfectly fine. Cash and tournament options, although I do lean a little bit more towards tournament option for Curry than I do Durant. Cleveland's lack of isolation and transition is also a pretty big boost to Durant, as Cleveland is allowing opponents to score 1.32 points per possession in transition and 1.08 points per possession in isolation. Durant, 17% of his possessions come in isolation, 24% come in transition. So again, both these guys, fantastic options here. Not primary options for me on the slate, but I do like them. We do know Kevon Looney coming in. Clearly, Kerr wants to play him as much as possible. He has talked about trying to play him close to 30 minutes if his body holds up. Looney, a guy, has dealt with some hip issues in the past. Coming off a really solid game against Atlanta, 29 minutes, 34 fantasy points, blocks and steals were appealing there. I like Kevon Looney in all formats, 4,200 on DraftKings, 4,800 on FanDuel. A little less appealing on FanDuel because of that extra, that price, and he's center eligible. But I'm perfectly fine with Kevon Looney in all formats, taking 85% of his shots at the rim. Cleveland allowing opponents to shoot 70% at the rim. You can still look at Jerebko and Jordan Bell as value options in this spot if you wish, although neither one of those guys is someone that I'm primarily looking at. Andre Iguodala is a fine punt option on FanDuel, just a guy going to get a little extra ball handling and going to play right around that 20-minute mark, but not really a fantastic option in this spot. looking at the Cleveland side of this game, obviously I mentioned Tristan Thompson double in 7 of the last 8 games. He's been absolutely crushing recently, coming in off a monster 19.14 rebound performance against the lowly Nets. Always going to be someone that I really like in cash and tournaments, especially with the shorthanded Cavs front court. He's perfectly fine in the spots. He is a little pricey, 7,300 on DraftKings, 7,700 on FanDuel. That does limit his upside a little bit, but again, perfectly fine in cash. Golden State allowing opponents to shoot 66.6% at the rim, where Tristan Thompson is taking 60% of his attempts. Rodney Hood going to play a lot of minutes. He's perfectly fine in tournaments. Colin Sexton, not someone that I'm really interested in here. Has taken a little bit of a hit over the past couple games with George Hill in the starting lineup alongside of him. He's still getting a decent amount of minutes, just not really looking at him here. He's not getting some of the assist opportunities that he was seeing before. George Hill is very interesting in the spot. Played 35 minutes against the Nets after being, announced that he was going to be limited to about 20 minutes. Gotta love coaches. If he's going to play 30 plus minutes, again, not someone that has a monster ceiling. I do realize he does have a 44 fantasy point outing recently, as about a month ago, recently in his terms, because he was injured for a while. 3,700, really cheap. George Hill's probably going to be very popular. I'm fine with taking a shot on George Hill in cash. He does have a pretty solid floor in a paced up matchup like this, just because of the amount of minutes that he should be playing. So I do have some interest in George Hill. Golden State has actually struggled a little bit against point guards. So George Hill, I do kind of like in the spot. I did mention Golden State allowing opponents to shoot 66.6% at the rim. 35% of his shots come at the rim. So he is perfectly fine as a value option here. Alec Burks continues to produce really well. I do have a lot of interest in Alec Burks as another value option here. Has been over 20 fantasy points in the game since coming over from Utah. He is perfectly fine in all formats, cash, GPPs. Again, someone that I think is going to be really popular. And then Jordan Clarkson as a tournament option is completely fine here. I don't really have a lot of interest in Chetty Osman or Larry Nance outside of sprinkling some of these guys in some tournament lineups, but they're not really guys that I have a lot of interest in. So let's move on to Denver, Orlando. Denver 5-point favorites in this one, 208.5 over under. Looking at the Denver side of things, we do know that Gary Harris is out for this game. Obviously, Will Barton still out with that groin injury. Nikola Jokic has reached double figures in rebounds and assists in the same game 3 times during the 6-game streak, winning streak that the Nuggets are on. This is a really good spot here. He is really still affordable, coming off a really big game against the Raptors. 9,200 on DraftKings, 9,400 on FanDuel. It is a really solid matchup for him here. Had dropped 23 points, 11 rebounds, 15 assists against the Raptors. But the interesting part with Jokic here, with Harris and Barton off the floor this season, Nikola Jokic, 35.2% usage rate, 1.75 fantasy points per minute. He's a guy I think you have to consider building around in this spot. Just the usage is just so freaking high in this matchup and in this spot. Like, I absolutely love him in all formats. Going to be a core option for me tonight. This was a spot last time these teams played, not too long ago, actually. It was a monster blowout. He played 23 minutes, still had 10 points, or 10 rebounds, 11 assists, and 40 plus fantasy points in just 23 minutes. Really good spot here for Jokic. Going to be someone that I have a ton of exposure to. Jamal Murray doesn't really see much of a usage boost outside usage boost or production boost with Harris off the floor, but it does secure his minutes a little bit more. Orlando 22nd in defensive efficiency to point guards, allowing them to shoot 37.1% from the floor or from three. This is an interesting spot for Jamal Murray at 6,700 on DraftKings, 7K on FanDuel. Doesn't project particularly well, and a lot of that comes from just his inconsistency overall in the season. But he's still taking a ton of shots, still taking a lot of 3-pointers, and this is a matchup where I think he can have some success here. I have a lot of interest in Jamal Murray in tournaments tonight. Does average 1.33 fantasy, or sorry, I'm looking at Millsap. Yeah, just Murray as a tournament option. Looking at Millsap, sees a really big boost, 1.33 fantasy points per minute with Harris and Barton off the floor. Paul Millsap continues to be a consistent option. Throwing out the Toronto game because that was just a putrid matchup. Still had some excellent rebounding in that game, just didn't shoot very well, but against this Orlando team, 23 minutes, 30 fantasy points last time out. I still really like Paul Millsap in cash. We can definitely look at Juancho Hernan-Gomez, a guy that I think is tournament viable. Not a ton of upside, but has been shooting a decent amount recently. It is a pretty solid matchup for Hernan-Gomez in this spots. I expect Torrey Craig and Malik Beasley to soak up the shooting guard minutes. Both those guys can be used in tournaments, especially on FanDuel where they're both under 4K. The problem is you're going to get Mike Malone riding the hot hand with whichever one of these guys is playing. Beasley has been pretty solid recently outside of the Portland game. So I mean that's at least something to consider. Again, you're getting Malone just going to ride the hot hand. Whichever one's playing really well, that's who is going to get used. Monte Morris, still a perfectly fine value option, especially on DraftKings at 3,700. Again, I mentioned this is a really good matchup for the backcourt of Denver. Looking at the Orlando side of things, I don't have a lot of interest in Orlando. I think there's better places to look tonight. You can definitely go with Vucevic, who is a little bit underpriced in the spot at 8,700. Continues to lead the team in usage, 26.5%, and touches at 71.3 per game. He's fine in cash, fine in tournaments. Again, I still would rather look elsewhere. Gordon is appealing in tournaments at his price tag, but again, still would probably rather look elsewhere. 6,800 though, if you're going to get some exposure to this game, or if you're building a bunch of tournament lineups, I would definitely get some Aaron Gordon exposure. You can use Ross and cash. He's still really, really cheap and still playing really, really well. So he's perfectly fine. Shot 7 of 8 against Denver last time these teams faced off. So yeah, that's pretty much all I have for Denver, or for the Orlando side of things. Looking at Washington, Atlanta, this is the game where I think a lot of ownership is going to get concentrated, and for a good reason. Washington 5-point favorites, 234.5 over under. Two really, really bad defenses. Washington giving up 117.1 points per game. Atlanta giving up 117.2. Both these teams playing really fast. Atlanta 108.4 pace on the season. Washington 105. So this is a paced up spot for Washington. I have a lot of interest in both sides of this game. Looking at the Washington side first, I think it would be a mistake to not have at least one of Bradley Beal or John Wall in your lineups tonight. Bradley Beal, very interesting, averaging 23.2 points on 51.1% shooting and 4.6 assists per game over his last 5 games. This is a fantastic spot for Bradley Beal. This is a fantastic spot for John Wall. Both of these guys should absolutely feast. Atlanta ranks 29th in defensive efficiency to point guards on the season, giving up 26.1 points, 7.4 rebounds, 9.6 assists. 46.2% field goal shooting, and 41.9% from 3. I do absolutely love John Wall in this spot. Taking a look at the projections, we can see John Wall projects to be a very, very solid play here, coming in at 9,400 on FanDuel, 9,400 on DraftKings, clocking just below 50 fantasy points in the spot. Bradley Beal also projects to be a really solid option here, clocking right around 43 fantasy points, 8,400 on DraftKings, 8,500 on FanDuel. Again, this is just an amazing spot for both these guys. 36% of Beal's shots come from three, 25% of his possessions are in transition. Atlanta really struggling, again, to defend the three-point line. Opponents are shooting 37.6% on three-pointers against Atlanta, and they're giving up 1.19 points per possession in transition. I think you need to have at least one of these guys in your lineups. You can use both if you wish, but using one or the other is a very, very, very good option here. If Satoransky is a guy I think he's going to gain a little bit of ownership across the industry. He's going to project really well. I think on just about anywhere that you look, he projects fairly solid in my model right now. That being said, if he's back in the starting lineup, I don't want to use Satoransky here. He just takes such a usage hit. He has like an 8% usage whenever he's in that starting lineup. So I don't have interest in him if he's in the starting lineup. If they go back to the Wall, Beal, Oubre, Porter, Bryant starting lineup, I think you can look at Satoransky if he's coming off the bench. That being said, Kelly Oubre, the guy that I have interest in, if Satoransky is in the starting lineup. I know this is probably getting a little confusing, but again, if Satoransky is starting, look at Kelly Oubre as a solid value option. If Oubre is starting, look at Satoransky as a solid value option. Kelly Oubre, obviously an excellent transition scorer. 60% of his field goal attempts come at the rim, or in the mid range, or from three. So this is a really, really good spot for Kelly Oubre, again, if he's coming off the bench. Markieff Morris continues to dominate off of the bench. He's perfectly fine in cash and tournaments. And then like Jeff Green, Austin Rivers, Thomas Bryant, none of these guys I'm really forcing into my lineups, but like Thomas Bryant could notch a really, really solid game here in limited minutes. So at 3,300, I do have a little bit of interest in Thomas Bryant as a guy that I think we could see like a 20 plus fantasy point outing out of Thomas Bryant. Not really great in tournaments, but if he makes your lineup work, go for it. Looking at the Atlanta side of things, this is where things get interesting because we know Taurean Prince and Alex Poitras are out. Atlanta still has like 400 players that they can roll out, and Lloyd Pierce continues to roll out a ton of guys every single night. But this is still a really good spot here for Atlanta. Looking at Trae Young, who has been absolutely putrid shooting over his last 5 games, shooting just 35.7% from the floor. If he was going to go off and have a good shooting night, it would probably happen tonight against a Washington team that's really bad on defense. Washington is allowing opponents to shoot 36.9% from three, 46.9% from the floor. Trae Young, obviously, we know he jacks up a lot of threes. Over his last 5 games, he's attempted 32. He's attempted 138 across 24 games already this season. Trae Young coming in at 6K on DraftKings. He's borderline cash on DraftKings just because he's so cheap, and the assist numbers are still going to be there for him. And Washington allowing 28.8 points, 6.4 rebounds, 10 assists, 45.6% field goal percentage, and almost 40% from three, 2-point guards. So Trae Young should absolutely feast here. More of a tournament option on FanDuel where he's 7K, but I do have a lot of interest in Trae Young in this spot. He does have a 31.4% usage rate without Taurean Prince on the floor. Kevin Huerter should get the start again. Kevin Huerter has been playing a decent amount of minutes recently and has not been terrible. Kevin Huerter coming in at just 3,700 on DraftKings. He is 4,600 on FanDuel. God, I hate FanDuel so much. But Kevin Huerter has been over 20 fantasy points in 3 straight games. This is a pretty good spot for him. Not going to take a ton of shots, but can get you some of those assists and things like that. So I do like Kevin Huerter as a value option. I like Kent Bazemore as a value option. I like DeAndre Bembry as value options. Bazemore 5,300 on FanDuel. Again, I hate FanDuel so much. Their pricing is just atrocious. DeAndre Bembry 5,200. Again, pricing is atrocious. These guys are really tough to trust at those prices, but there's not a whole lot of places to go tonight. Like they're going to get usage boosts, they're going to get production boosts. I think we have to look at him, especially on like DraftKings at their prices. Kent Bazemore, really tough to trust. Has not been playing very good recently, but he's an option here. DeAndre Bembry at 3,700, really intriguing here. Should get a few extra minutes, usage boost as well. So he's perfectly fine in cash and tournaments. Dwayne Dedmon's going to be a very, very, very popular option here tonight, coming in at 3,900 on DraftKings, 5K on FanDuel. I don't care for him on FanDuel. You can use him if you wish. You can use them if you wish, but like Washington giving up 48.5 rebounds per game. They're giving up a lot of second chance points, 15.3. This is a good spot here for Dwayne Dedmon. 35% of his shots come from at the rim, where Washington is allowing opponents to shoot 63.5% from the floor. 11% of his shots come from on corner threes, 39.8% field goal percentage allowed by Washington, and then 21% on above the break threes, where he takes 37.9% of his shots. Dwayne Dedmon, a fantastic option on DraftKings. I need to fix my notes here real quick. Outside of that, Alex Lynn, not really someone that I'm really interested in, but again, a guy that you can sprinkle in your lineup. Justin Anderson, a tournament option, especially on FanDuel at 3,500, could see a few extra minutes here. Does have the ability to put up really, really solid numbers in limited minutes. Jeremy Lin, 5,500 on DraftKings, 4,900 on FanDuel, projects to be a really, really solid option here as well. Pulling up his game log against Golden State and just looking at his game log in general, he has been getting a decent amount of minutes. Does do a little bit of everything that can play alongside Trae Young, will play in blowouts. This is a pretty good spot for Jeremy Lin, who has been absolutely smashing of late. Moving on. Moving on to the next game. 1 second. We have Oklahoma City at Brooklyn. Oklahoma City 7.5-point favorites, 217.5 over under. Russell Westbrook is Russell Westbrook. If you want to play Russell Westbrook, you play Russell Westbrook. I don't think he's the best star on the slate to pay up for, but it is Russell Westbrook. Oklahoma City is one of the most straightforward breakdowns just about every single night. Eventually, I'm just going to start copying and pasting my analysis from every Oklahoma City game and just reusing it, because it's never really going to change. Russ, 31.1% usage rate on the season. It's fine. Brooklyn, I think, better on defense than people give them credit for. They do play a little bit slower than I think people realize, but it's still a perfectly fine option. I really like Paul George as a cash game option. He's never going to project particularly well. I was going to project in like the high 30s, low 40s, but this is a really good spot here for Paul George. I think he's someone that I do have a decent amount of interest in, just because he plays a ton of minutes and he does fill up the stat sheet, and it is a really good spot here for him. So Paul George, perfectly fine in all formats. The rest of this team, you can look at Jeremy Grant. I think he's perfectly fine against a team that does struggle to rebound a little bit. And then Adams, he's a little bit pricey, 6,700 on DraftKings, 7,700 on FanDuel. Better play on DraftKings. We know Brooklyn really, really bad against centers. Adams, one of the best offensive rebounders in the NBA. Brooklyn giving up 15.9 second chance points. Not really telling you anything that you don't already know here. Looking at the Brooklyn side of things, I don't have a lot of interest in Brooklyn, but it is worth noting, since Karis LeVert went down 11 games ago, D'Angelo Russell has posted a 31.3% usage rate, averages 19.6 points on just under 20 field goal attempts per game, and 40.2% shooting. D'Angelo Russell, coming in off another monster game, has had some pretty high upside games of late and not great matchups. Obviously went off against Memphis. That was an overtime or double overtime game, but Cleveland had a really solid game. Utah had a really solid game. Philly had a really solid game. D'Angelo Russell in tournaments I do really like. Dinwiddie is still someone that I think we can consider in cash. Since LeVert went down, he has been under He's been like a 26% usage rate, but 17.9 points per game on 12.8 field goal attempts and 45% field goal shooting. If Joe Harris is out, obviously that boosts the minutes for Russell and Dinwiddie. That also puts Shabazz Napier as someone that we can look at as a value in tournaments. Jared Allen's fine in GPPs, but there's so many really, really good center options on the slate. I don't really want to go there tonight. Moving on, we have Philly at Toronto. This game is more appealing from a real-life basketball perspective, I think, than a fantasy basketball perspective. I don't really care to attack too much of it. I will say Joel Embiid is really, really cheap, I think, across the industry for the upside he has, even though it is not a very good matchup. Joel Embiid coming in at 10-3 on DraftKings, 10-7 on FanDuel. Just looking at his game logs, again, it is a very tough matchup. The dude's averaging almost 55 fantasy points per game, but he is really, really consistent, getting you 40 plus every single night with a lot of upside, and actually had a really solid game against this Raptors team the last time they faced off, putting up 55 fantasy points. I like Joel Embiid a significant amount here, especially in tournaments where I think he's going to be really, really, really low owned. Joel Embiid, a perfectly fine option here. Ben Simmons shooting 67.3% from the field over his last 5 games, averaging 16.2 points and 8.4 assists. I do really like really like Simmons here as a really good tournament option. Again, not someone I have a lot of interest in cash, but this is another spot where like he has triple-double upside. And if he continues to shoot really, really well, like he has potential to put up a really solid game here. 41% of Jimmy Butler's field goal attempts are in the mid-range. Toronto's allowing opponents to shoot 42% in the mid-range. Jimmy Butler, 6,900 on DraftKings. Again, really appealing in tournaments. FanDuel, 7,900, not that appealing. I think there will be better places to look, but we're getting to the point where Jimmy Butler's entering like territory where we have to consider him every night in tournaments. Had a really solid outing against Toronto the last time he played them, so I really like Jimmy Butler in tournaments here. Looking at the Toronto side, I do have more interest in the Toronto side of this game than I do the Philly side. Looking at two of my favorite options, obviously we know Kawhi Leonard, very, very, very good. Leads the team in usage right around 29%, basically a 40 fantasy point floor most nights. Obviously did not have that against Denver, but still shooting really, really well recently over the last 5 games, 50% from the floor, averaging just under 50 fantasy points. I like Kawhi Leonard a significant amount in cash and tournaments tonight. I also really, really like Pascal Siakam and Serge Ibaka. Siakam, a guy that has been really solid recently. Over his last 5 games, averaging just over 32 fantasy points, but shooting really well, 71% from the floor, 40% from 3, getting you those assists and rebounds. Philly really, really bad against power forwards, 26th in defensive efficiency to the position, 48.2% shooting allowed. They allow 1.11 points per possession on spot ups. Siakam spotting up about 25% of the time this season. I really like Pascal Siakam as a cash option, but also a really, really solid way to get exposure to this game in tournaments. Had a good game against this team last time out. I expect him to see 30 plus minutes here tonight. Serge Ibaka is very interesting. Again, I mentioned they do struggle against power forwards, but we know Serge Ibaka is playing the center position most of the time this season. There has been a couple times where he has gotten some minutes at the 4. I don't expect that to be the case tonight, but Serge Ibaka against this Philly team last time they faced off, really, really solid game. Not a lot has changed. I think Serge Ibaka is a very, very interesting tournament option, especially at 5,800 and 5,900 on FanDuel. Looking at the rest of this team, I do like Danny Green as a cheap way to get exposure here. We've been targeting some of these spot-up shooters against Philly for a long time now, and Danny Green, a fantastic spot-up shooter. So Danny Green coming in at 4,400 on DraftKings, 4,700 on FanDuel. A little too cheap again for a guy that's going to play 30 plus minutes, can get you some of those steals and blocks. He just needs to hit his shots, which he didn't do against Denver, but was doing really well in the few games before that. Has been shooting really well, especially from three all season long. So Danny Green, very, very interesting value option here tonight. Moving on, looking at the Clippers at Memphis. This game opened as a pick'em with a 212.5 over under, really low total for a Clippers game. Looking at the Clippers side of this, I don't really have interest in much at all. Tobias Harris has been really good, has scored 24 or more points in 6 of the past 9 games, has knocked down at least 50% of his field goal attempts in 15 of his last 21 games. Danilo Gallinari has 4 20-point efforts in the past 6 games. Lou Williams has scored at least 20 points 3 times in the past 4 games. These guys are playing really well. It's just a really, really, really bad matchup. There's just not a whole lot to like about picking on this Memphis team. They rank basically top 10 in defensive efficiency to just about every position across the board. Just not a great spot here for anybody. You can look at Lou Williams. You can look at Tobias Harris and Danilo Gallinari. It is worth noting that Memphis is giving up 16.3 fast break points per game. Those 3 guys do lead the team in fast break points. They're just not guys I'm looking at tonight. I much rather I do have more interest in the Memphis side of this game, and that's where I'm going to get my exposure if I am going to get exposure here. Obviously, Mike Conley coming in off of a really solid stretch of games. Mike Conley priced up 8,700 on DraftKings, 9,100 on FanDuel. He's been just really solid. Philly, obviously, only 36 fantasy points, but monster game against Brooklyn, Toronto, New York. This Clippers team put up just shy of 40 fantasy points in 30 minutes last time they played. I have a lot of interest in Mike Conley. Playing a lot of minutes, getting the assists. It's worth noting, Conley he's averaging 11.6 potential assists per game, but he's averaging just 6.6 actual assists. So I think that's going to regress, and I think we're going to start to see more of these 8, 9, 10, 11 assist games with the scoring opportunities that he has in this offense. It's a really, really good spot for Mike Conley. So he's cash viable for sure, and tournament viable as well. I don't think he's going to be a very popular option here. Marc Gasol, a great option on DraftKings at 8,600. Not so great option on FanDuel at 10-2. But again, going to be overlooked. I think this game as a whole, especially Memphis, will be overlooked outside of one guy that I'm going to get to in just a second. But Marc Gasol, monster game against the Clippers last time these teams faced off. And this Clippers team has just been abused by centers all season long. They're giving up the 5th most fantasy points per game to the position. They're giving up 46 rebounds per game, 14.8 second chance points, 50.3 points in the paint. Like, everything lines up for Marc Gasol to be a really, really, really solid option. They're giving up 1.03 points per possession on post-ups. We know Marc Gasol can post up just about anybody. 27% of his possessions this season are post-ups. I have a lot of interest in Marc Gasol at 8,600. I would like to potentially pair Jokic and Gasol in my lineups tonight as a great way to get a lot of safety in my lineups. So I do have a lot of interest in him. Jaren Jackson Jr., the guy I think will be very popular. Obviously, foul trouble, always a concern for Jaren Jackson Jr. 75% of his field goal attempts do come at the rim or in the paint, where opponents are kind of struggling. Like, again, Clippers giving up 50.3 points in the paint, allowing opponents to shoot 62% at the rim. Obviously, gets a little bit of a boost with the rebounding potential. But with the Clippers also, 83% of Harrell's field goal attempts come at the rim. 30% of Tobias's field goal attempts come at the rim. 34% of Gallinari's come at the rim. 42% of Shai Gilgeous-Alexander's field goal attempts come at the rim. A lot of these guys are going to be taking shots at the rim. That leads to upside for Jaren Jackson Jr. to get some blocks as long as he can stay out of foul trouble. He can get some of those help side blocks and things like that. Tonight, this is a pretty good spot. He actually did have a really solid game against this team last time they faced off. Had 3 blocks in that game, 8 of 15 from the floor for 38 fantasy points. So I have some interest in Jaren Jackson Jr. here. Moving on, Detroit at Milwaukee, 227.5 over under. Milwaukee 8-point favorites in this game. Injury news to notes, Reggie Bullock is out. Ersan Ilyasova is doubtful. Doesn't do a whole lot with Ilyasova being doubtful for Milwaukee, but Reggie Bullock being out does do some things for Detroit. We did see Langston Galloway get the start in the second half for Detroit with Reggie Bullock going down. So that's something that we do have to keep an eye on. Blake Griffin scored 20 points against OKC, has notched at least 20 points in 4 straight games and 8 of the past 9. I have a lot of interest in Blake Griffin here. Coming in at 9K on both sites. Power forward, not really my favorite position on the slate. This is an interesting spot, though. They're allowing opponents to shoot 45% in both the paint and the mid-range. We've talked about it countless times. Milwaukee just getting abused in the mid-range. They're letting people take open shots in the mid-range. But they're really stingy at the rim and defending. They're not defending the three-point line very well, but opponents just aren't shooting very well from 3 against them. But at the rim, they're allowing just 58% shooting. That's one of the best marks in the NBA, if not the best mark. 40% of Griffin's shots do come at the rim, but 30% of his shots come in the paint or in the mid-range. Does see a pretty big usage boost, 33.3% usage rate, and averages 1.36 fantasy points per minute with Bullock off the floor. 30.2% of his possessions are post-ups. Milwaukee allowing 0.93 points per possession on post-ups this season. I have a lot of interest in Blake Griffin in this spot. Really, really solid option. I don't know if I can afford him based on how my lineup construction is probably going to work, but he's still a fantastic option here. Drummond is perfectly fine in tournaments. 8,800 on DraftKings, 9,300 on FanDuel. Obviously has monster upside. The biggest concern that I have is with Brook Lopez on the offensive end, he can pull Drummond away from the basket, and that does potentially hurt his upside here, given that he's not going to be playing close enough to the basket to gobble up some of those rebounds. Again, tournament option for sure. Not someone that I really want to look at in cash. Reggie, 29.1% usage rate without Reggie Bullock on the floor, takes 37% of his shots in the mid-range. He's fine in tournaments. Doesn't project to be a particularly strong option, and he does struggle with consistency, but at 5,100 on DraftKings, that's intriguing. 5,200 on FanDuel. He does have some upside. We've seen it in some of these games. 29 fantasy points against Golden State, 27 or 33 against the Knicks, 39 against Phoenix, 37 against Houston. Does have potential. It's minutes that are really concerning, but without Reggie Bullock, hopefully his minutes are going to be a little more secure. Probably would have gotten over 30 minutes against OKC had that game not been like a 500-point blowout. I did mention Langston Galloway. Very intriguing value option here. I mentioned. Hey, what's up, guys? The last video got a little bit messed up towards the middle/second half of the recording, right as I was getting ready to talk about Langston Galloway being a value option to consider on the slate. So I am picking up right there where I left off on that one, and going to continue to talk about the slate I just covered, Reggie Jackson, and was moving on to Langston Galloway, who I really, really like. So popping over to DraftKings to take a look at his player profile. Langston Galloway is someone that is very, very interesting here. Started the second half for Reggie Bullock last game. Should see about 28 to 30 minutes tonight. 28% of his shots are corner threes. Milwaukee allowing opponents to shoot 42.6% on corner threes. Again, I like him a significant amount as a value option. Um, he's a guy should chuck whenever he's in there. I expect him to get about 8 to 10 um, field goal attempts. Has not been shooting very well recently, 33% from the floor, but 40% on the season. I do like him a little bit as a guy that we can definitely consider as a value. More of a guy on like FanDuel at 3,500 where you can drop his score, potentially like a GPP value on DraftKings. And then I was going to talk about Stanley Johnson, who is very interesting as well, coming in at 3,700 on or 3,600 on DraftKings and 4,200 on FanDuel. I don't think anybody can slow down Giannis, but I do think Dwayne Casey's going to try to throw Stanley Johnson out there for a decent amount of minutes. Has taken a lot of shots over his last couple games. Does have some upside, especially at 3,600. So he is a little bit interesting here tonight. Looking at the Detroit side of things, Detroit is allowing opponents to shoot 68.9% at the rim this season. So it's really hard not to love Giannis, who is taking 66% of his shots at the rim. Giannis coming in has topped 30 points in 5 of his last 6 games, has recorded 8 straight double-doubles. Giannis has been going absolutely bananas of late. Giannis, very interesting, 11-6 on DraftKings. He's like 12-7 on FanDuel. A little tougher to pay for on this slate, but someone to definitely consider here. Yeah, 12-7 on FanDuel. He's just been playing really, really well. Over 65 fantasy points in 3 of the last 4. Scrolling through his player card, it's just a lot of 50s, 60s, 70s, 140, but like really safe floor, playing a lot of minutes. Great spot here for Giannis. I absolutely love him in all formats. I don't have a lot of interest in Bledsoe and Middleton. It's just not like a spot where I really, really care to use either one of them. It is worth noting 53% of Malcolm Brogdon's field goal attempts come at the rim, with another 15% coming in the paint or the mid-range. That does make him an interesting value option here tonight. Or not value, but an interesting mid-range option here tonight, especially in cash games across the industry. Brook Lopez, very, very interesting here. Pulling up his player card, he is really affordable across the industry. 5,200 on DraftKings. He is 5,500 on FanDuel. Against Andre Drummond the last 4 seasons, here are his fantasy point totals: 52.3, 33.8, 42.3, 57.8, 40.3, 29.8, 19.8, 41.3. The only games where he did not play a ton of minutes were the 19.3 fantasy point outing, but he had like a 57.8 fantasy points in 29 minutes one time. Obviously, different team, different offensive scheme, all that kind of good stuff, but he is still playing a lot of minutes. I mean, he did see 30 against Chicago, 27, 29, 28, 29. This is a really good spot for Brook Lopez against a Detroit team that does really struggle against centers. I like taking a shot on Brook Lopez in tournaments here. It's going to be an interesting play, but I think I do like him a little bit tonight. Moving on, Charlotte, Minnesota. Minnesota 5-point favorites in this one, 221 over under. It might be a somewhat unpopular opinion, but I don't have that much interest in Charlotte's side of things tonight. There's a couple of value plays that I'll get to in just a second that are interesting. Starting with Kemba Walker. Kemba Walker struggling of late, 19.2 points on 34.5% shooting over his last 5 games. I don't expect that to continue, or don't expect that to improve tonight, with Robert Covington being someone that Thibodeau is going to throw at him a significant amount. I very rarely overrate individual defensive matchups, but Minnesota's defense has been stellar over the last like 11 or 12 games since Jimmy Butler has been traded, and a lot of that has to do with Robert Covington. Since December 10th, the Wolves have posted a 101.2 defensive rating. They just held the Rockets to 9 points in the fourth quarter. Last game, 29 points in the second half overall. Robert Covington being on Kemba Walker really scares me. You can still use Walker in tournaments. That's fine. He's risky, but yeah, I think there's better options tonight. I personally won't be going there. Looking at the rest of this, Nick Batum has been absolutely atrocious recently. Pretty much most of the season he's been absolutely atrocious. But because of the way that the Timberwolves defensive scheme works out with Covington defending the point guard primarily, and Teague, Rose, Wiggins sliding down and defending the wing players. That has opened things up for small forwards who have been shooting pretty well from three against the Wolves over the last 10 games. They're shooting 37% from three. They're getting some extra rebounds and things like that just because of the way the way the defensive scheme breaks down. Nick Batum, again, has been absolutely atrocious, but he's really cheap. He's 4,800 on DraftKings. That's pretty appealing in the spot. Pulling up his pricing on FanDuel, he's 5,300 on FanDuel, a little less appealing. But James Borrego has talked about needing to get him going and needing to get him to take shots and hit those shots. So it could be a spot where we can get some exposure here in tournaments. Looking at the rest of these guys, Miles Bridges is going to be very popular. Miles Bridges got the second half start last game whenever Marvin Williams went down. Miles Bridges, 4,100 on DraftKings, very appealing. Again, going to be a popular option. Has been playing pretty solid recently, shooting the ball really, really well over the last 3 games. Has been shooting pretty well on the season. I expect Borrego to try to get him as many minutes as possible, as long as he's not playing like absolute garbage. If he's playing like crap, then Michael Kidd-Gilchrist is the guy that could get the bulk of the minutes with Marvin Williams being out. Looking at FanDuel, at least a little bit of a strategy here on FanDuel where Miles Bridges is 5,300 and Michael Kidd-Gilchrist is 4,200. I think if you're building a bunch of tournament lineups, you make the pivot from Bridges to Kidd-Gilchrist. In cash, I think you can use Bridges. That's fine. On DraftKings, I think you make the same move. If you're building a bunch of tournament lineups, you go from Bridges to Kidd-Gilchrist, who is a little bit cheap, is $100 cheaper. Kidd-Gilchrist with Williams off the floor is averaging 1.05 fantasy points per minute. Again, I only have him projected right around 20 minutes. If Bridges struggles and they insert Kidd-Gilchrist in the lineup and he does produce in this spot and you have him in tournaments at a very low ownership, at least what I think will be a low ownership, that could definitely pay off for you here tonight. Don't overlook Frank Kaminsky, who has been playing a little bit better recently, has played his way into that center rotation. Also think he could get a couple minutes at the power forward position. Frank Kaminsky coming in at 3,700 on DraftKings and 3,900 on FanDuel. I like him a lot on FanDuel as one of your drop the score options, but Frank Kaminsky has been playing pretty well recently, and we have seen Minnesota, despite their recent defensive surge, struggle with second chance points and a little bit at the rim. So I'm fine with Frank Kaminsky in this spot. Looking at Dallas, New Orleans, Nikola Mirotic is the only one that is questionable for this game. New Orleans 6-point favorites, 230.5 over under. I like DeAndre Jordan as a guy that's you would play in tournaments expecting him to get a lot of minutes. And I just realized I completely glossed over the Minnesota side of the last game. So let me go back here real quick to the Minnesota side of the Charlotte-Minnesota game. Towns, really, really solid center option on the slate. He is a little bit pricey, but that's for good reason. He has been going off since November 10th when they traded Jimmy Butler. He's averaging 21.6 points on 16.1 field goal attempts per game to go along with his 13.3 rebounds. His team high 27% usage rate and 40% rebounding rate. Charlotte does rank 19th in defensive efficiency to centers on the season, is allowing them to score 23.3 points with 15.9 rebounds against them. 24% of his possessions come on post-ups. Charlotte is allowing 1.03 points per possession on post-ups this season. I do like Karl-Anthony Towns in all formats. Unfortunately, I don't know how he's going to fit in my lineups with me liking a couple of other centers. Looking at the rest of this team, Covington has historically been pretty good against the Hornets. He has several games where he has scored at least over the last 4 seasons. He has 5 games where he has scored at least 38 fantasy points, and that is over 13 game sample. He also has 3 games where he has scored at least 31 fantasy points. So he's been pretty darn consistent against the the Hornets. Did have a couple monster upside games recently as well, dating back to last season where he had a 50.8, and one game this season where he scored 45.5. Covington, a guy, can spot up from the corners. Again, I mentioned he's going to play a ton of minutes here. It's a really good spot for Covington. I like him in cash. I'm not really looking at Wiggins, Rose, Teague. Teague's fine in cash. Wiggins, Rose are fine in tournaments, but there's just better places to spend that salary tonight, I think. All right, back to Dallas, where I was going to talk about DeAndre Jordan, who has reached double digits in rebounds in 20 of his 22 games this season. I like DeAndre Jordan as a tournament option because he should play a significant amount of minutes. Going up against Anthony Davis, I expect DeAndre Jordan to mirror most of his minutes on the floor tonight, and that has me interested in him. There are a lot of games where he doesn't get a lot of touches, and that is a little bit concerning. But with New Orleans struggling to defend in the paint, like Jordan does have a pretty safe floor in the spot here. I'm going to pull up how he has performed against New Orleans just to kind of double check this. Obviously, these were with the Clippers, not with Dallas. 34, 39, 37, 35, 28, and 22 minutes in those games. 30.8, 49.3, 34.5, 39.3, 39, and 34.3. Has put up some pretty solid games in limited minutes the last two games. 39 fantasy points in 28 minutes, 34 fantasy points in 22. Without looking at those games, I would assume maybe those are blowouts. But DeAndre Jordan, I think, is a really, really good tournament option. Luka Doncic, really, really good in transition, really, really good in fast, in the operating in the fast break. Where New Orleans is struggling, they're giving up 15.3 fast break points per game. I like Luka Doncic. Averages 2.6 fast break points. Doesn't sound like that much, but if you factor in like New Orleans really below average in defending in the fast break, that boosts his potential to score in the spot. 20% of his possessions come in transition. New Orleans does struggle to defend both of those in transition and in spot ups, where another 15% of Doncic possessions come from. Unfortunately, DraftKings continues to waffle back and forth about what position they want him to play, or they want him listed at, and none of those positions are the actual position that he fucking plays at. But Luka Doncic, point guard eligible, only 6,700 is really appealing. He's shooting guard eligible on DraftKings or on FanDuel. Still not the right fucking position, but 7,200, really, really solid tournament option. I like him better on FanDuel because he's not point guard eligible. Dennis Smith Jr. is perfectly fine in tournaments. Again, I mentioned, New Orleans struggling in transition, really struggling in the fast break, struggling in isolation. Those are some spots where Dennis Smith can pick them apart. But I think there's better point guard options. Just a guy that I would get some tournament exposure to if you're building a bunch of lineups. Harrison Barnes let me down last night. Still played a decent amount of minutes. Still took a decent amount of shots. I do like going back to the well with Harrison Barnes in the spot. New Orleans ranks, let's see, 26th in defensive efficiency to small forwards. 10% of Barnes' field goal attempts are corner threes. Opponents are shooting 43.9% on corner threes against New Orleans. New Orleans just struggling to defend the three-point line overall, allowing opponents to shoot 37%. And we do have Wesley Matthews, who is taking 51% of his shots from beyond the arc. I do have some interest in Wesley Matthews at 4,700 in a very fast-paced game. Going to take a lot of shots. Has just been pretty consistently getting you 20-plus fantasy points most nights with some upside. I have some interest in Wesley Matthews as a cheap way to get exposure to the Dallas side of this game. Looking at the New Orleans side, obviously Anthony Davis, he is good at basketball. I do like Anthony Davis in all formats. More of a tournament option for me because I think Giannis is a slightly better play. But Anthony Davis has been just phenomenal at home this season. I don't believe in home road splits outside of a couple of just very unique circumstances. But Anthony Davis at home this season, 62.6 fantasy points. On the road, 58% or 58.1 fantasy points. It really just comes down to, I don't really know. If you look at his splits, it doesn't really make much sense. He's shooting the same at on the road, shooting I guess better from three, which is interesting, but not. I don't know. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The home road splits for Davis just don't make that much sense. So forget about it. It doesn't matter. 60%, 47% of his shots come at the rim, where Dallas is allowing opponents to shoot 66%. He's great in all formats. I still think I like Giannis more, especially on DraftKings. I even like LeBron a little bit more, I think. Looking at some value options here, Tim Frazier is a really solid value option here. Continues to play a decent amount of minutes. Alvin Gentry likes having him in the starting lineup because he can help push the pace. It's a pretty good spot for Tim Frazier here, who should be able to bounce back from a down game. Has potential to get some extra assists here. 39% of his field goal attempts are above the break threes. Opponents have shot almost 38% on above the break threes against Dallas. I do like Tim Frazier as a value option here. Jrue Holiday, 40 fantasy points, floor basically, upside, blah, blah, blah. Good matchup. I don't know. There's nothing I can say about Jrue Holiday that I haven't said a million times. He's a good cash game option. He's a good tournament option. You're basically plugging in 40 fantasy points with upside and moving on with Jrue Holiday. Mirotic is fine in all formats if he plays. Again, I mentioned Dallas struggling to defend above the break threes. That's a spot where Mirotic can really punish them. If he sits, Jrue Holiday becomes a better play. Anthony Davis becomes a little bit of a better play. But Julius Randle, who just went bananas in his last game whenever Mirotic was out, would become a core option for me. I do like Julius Randle in tournaments, especially on DraftKings, if Mirotic plays or if we don't have that news going into the game. Moving on, last game of the night, San Antonio at Lakers. Lakers 8-point favorites, 222 over under. This is the late night hammer, and I would definitely be getting some exposure here just because this game tips off 2.5 hours after Dallas, New Orleans, and there's a chance this game could be popular. All the other games are going to be like almost over by the time this one starts. Spurs have been really bad recently, and that is really concerning. 3 straight games they have lost. They've lost 3 of the last 4 games. All of those games, they've lost by more than 30 points. That is a little concerning, yes, especially when you're considering looking at these guys. That being said, there's still some spots where I think we can attack with the Spurs. It is worth noting that Popovich did mention a couple weeks ago that he needed to start resting some of the veterans. I find it hard to believe that he's going to do that whenever they're playing so poorly, but it is Popovich, so we do need to keep an eye on that. LaMarcus Aldridge is probably going to be someone that's garnish some ownership in the spot because Lakers really, really bad against opposing big men. It is worth noting, and I don't think this trend continues all season long, but it is an alarming trend for LaMarcus Aldridge so far this season. It's not something that has historically been that big of an issue for him, but in 4 back-to-back games this season, Aldridge has just been atrocious, averaging 26.4 fantasy points per game and shooting just 33% from the floor in those 4 back-to-back games. Again, I don't think that continues the entire season, but it's a trend to monitor and keep in mind when you're considering him. For now, until that trend rectifies itself, I will say I do like him more in tournaments than cash games. Lakers ranked 28th in defensive efficiency to shooting guards on the season. DeMar DeRozan has just gone bonkers against his team in 2 outings already. He's averaging like 64.5 fantasy points. DeMar DeRozan, 8,900 on DraftKings, 8,400 on FanDuel. My favorite way to get exposure to the Spurs in this game. I do like a significant amount of DeMar DeRozan exposure here. Bryn Forbes, Patty Mills, Derek White. Flip a coin. Nothing stands out for, I don't really think anything stands out for any of those 3 guys in this spot. Looking at the Lakers, they do struggle a little bit against isolation and transition, but none of those guys really excel in either of those spots. So, yeah, they're just guys. Like I think Forbes is probably the more intriguing option, but yeah, they're 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 just kind of guys. Rudy Gay definitely interesting. I mentioned the Spurs struggling in isolation. 18% of or 18.6% of his possessions come in transition or in isolation. I do like Rudy Gay as a really good mid-range option here. Davis Bertans is fine in tournaments or on FanDuel as a uh, punt option. I like him as a small forward punt over on FanDuel. Um, Jakob Pertl, I don't think we should chase the Jakob Pertl game. Again, his big games, I think one big game recently and a couple solid games have come when they've been down by like 30 points. He's not getting minutes unless they're just getting absolutely destroyed, which means like you're only using him if you're counting on this game being a blowout, in which case you're probably not using Rudy Gay or LaMarcus Aldridge or DeMar DeRozan. So if you have interest in any of those guys, then you can't use Jakob Pertl because it's just counterintuitive to the other three guys being good plays. So yeah, Jakob Pertl fine if you plan on this game being a blowout. But if you think it stays close and you have interest in those other any of those other three guys, you can't use Jakob Pertl here. Looking at the Lakers side of things, I do love LeBron. Excellent option in all formats. It's interesting to know that he's getting really pissed off at Luke Walton for taking him out of games. Like he wants to play more, and he's getting pissed off when Luke Walton subs him out. It's kind of funny. But against the Spurs this season, 33.5 points, 9.5 rebounds, 9 assists in 2 previous games. LeBron James at like 10-5 on DraftKings. Really, really, really appealing here. Just going to play a decent amount. He's averaging, I think, the lowest amount of minutes he's averaged in quite a while. I have it in my notes here, but 34.7 minutes is what he's averaging so far this season. That's the lowest mark of his 16-year career. It's kind of crazy, but he's still producing really solid numbers in those limited minutes. I do like him a significant amount. Spurs getting lit up in the paint in the mid-range. They're allowing 44.7% shooting in the paint, 43.7% shooting in the mid-range. It's a pretty big boost to Ingram, who takes 46% of his shots in those two areas. Brandon Ingram, a solid cash game option in this spot, has been really, really inconsistent so far this season, but at 5,500 on DraftKings, I have some interest in him. Hasn't actually played the Spurs this season, missed both those games, but I do like him a little bit here. Ball definitely intriguing in tournaments. Has been just really inconsistent all season long. But the Spurs allowing 0.94 points per possession to the pick and roll ball handler, 36.8% on above the break threes. Lonzo taking 41% of his shots on above the break threes. 17% of his shots come in the mid range, either in the paint or the mid range, and 33% of his shots come at the rim. San Antonio allowing 64.5% shooting at the rim. I do like some tournament exposure to Lonzo Ball at 5,200 on DraftKings. Not really that interested on FanDuel. Kuzma's fine in cash, still playing a decent amount of minutes. And it is a pretty good spot for him as well. And then I think on FanDuel, if you're wanting to punt, shooting guard Josh Hart is very interesting here. But that covers the second half of this slate. Good luck in all your contests tonight, and I will see you guys on Friday.